was basically an overlay of a program. It was not an operating system that understood the world really needed many programs running at the same time, not interfering with each other. It didn't understand that we would eventually have networks and people far away were going to have to operate your computer. It didn't have a good operating system underneath like the Lisa did. We were not going to get that great Lisa computer back again in our life at Apple until we put Steve Jobs' own OS X on the Macintosh something like 15 years later, much, much later in time. But so the Macintosh was introduced. It caught on right away as the newest, hottest thing in my life. When Steve Jobs introduced it in an auditorium at Apple Computer, I was in the audience and my heart was just beating, thinking this is the biggest change ever in computing. Nobody's ever seen a machine like this. This is so beautiful. And we all, actually all of us in Apple believe in this vision that that was the future. The trouble is it wasn't really a hardy enough computer. It didn't have any software. It didn't have programs that did useful things for people. So the Macintosh sales fell down to almost zero. We had a factory designed to build 80,000 Macintoshes a month, and we were only selling 500 a month. Our stock collapsed in half based on that. It had been pumped up, and we had to take desperate action to save a company. And the action to save the company was keep the Apple II sales, the revenues from the Apple II going for another few years, and build the Macintosh market. It took a lot of hard work. We had to send reps out into the field to universities, encouraging them to buy groups of Macintoshes, to industry, encouraging them to buy hundreds of Macintoshes. We had to send reps to meet with developers and get them to write software programs that were useful. We went to Microsoft and we needed business software. We got them to write Excel spreadsheet for the Macintosh before it was on a PC. It was actually written for the Macintosh. And that was because we had to build a market up where people could do useful things with the Macintosh. More importantly than that, over the next 3 years before the Macintosh finally supplanted the Apple II sales. Apple II would decline, Macintosh would increase. 3 years it took. And during that time, the price of memory chips came down, down, down to where it was finally affordable. Macintosh got a great image because we introduced it as changing the world. That's what Apple stood for. So the image to the company was great, even though the product had failed at first. Steve Jobs had left the company because he wasn't really the one that was capable of taking the steps needed to save the company and rescue it financially. He wasn't able to wait 3 years and market the Macintosh and keep the Apple II heavily supported. He wanted to kill the Apple II, actually. So he left. I think he was a little bit embarrassed by the Macintosh failure, and he started another company called Next to build a computer. And it felt to me like a little bit disloyal. Why do you leave your great company, Apple, that you've started, that stands for so much in the world, that we never got bought out by some bigger company? We wanted to be our own company forever. We didn't want to just be some division of somebody else. And we had succeeded, and he left to form another company building a different computer, almost like competition, a little disloyal. The Next computer also failed on its own. Steve Jobs, while he was away, matured. He changed into a very different person. He learned how to build a company and keep all the legs of a company, all of them operating well and operating in succession and going in the same direction. He realized that even like the Apple II, which came the entire design, the hardware, the software, the building work, the thinking work, it all came from one mind, which made it one nice, good-to-use product. He realized that in himself, that he had to have one mind totally in control of what the final product would be and not let it go helter-skelter off in the other directions that maybe engineers in the company wanted it to go. You need one strong mind no matter what. I look at Apple today, people ask me all the time, how do you think Apple's going to be without Steve Jobs? And my answer is, it would take 2 years, which we've about had, to actually determine what it's going to be, but you're going to see it coming from the inner strength of whoever's leading Apple, which is Tim Cook. Does he have the internal integrity to envision good products and make sure that they get completed and don't get left behind? Johnny Ives is his partner too. It doesn't necessarily take one person, but it takes a very tiny number of people at the top to not let things go off in every direction that people in the company want them to, but keep one strong focus. And that was when Steve Jobs returned. He wasn't sure Apple would succeed. We had one product, the Macintosh computer, and it had a small amount of the market share of the world, 10%, 8%, 7%, 6%. It was just, you know, not just, it was enough, we were selling enough, you know, to keep our company alive and healthy. It had such a high profit margin. We were probably the most profitable computer company in the world with such even a low market percentage. But something was wrong and we couldn't really ever increase it. To this day, we've never really increased it hugely over the PCs that the huge businesses buy, the huge industry buys, enterprise buys. But Steve came back and he got this company in really good solid shape, every element of it. Just before he came back, we had sold off, we had canceled all the departments in the company, the projects that weren't really making money, that weren't essential to our health. We had gotten out of the rent of buildings that we no longer needed because we had reduced our staff. So he had things in good shape, but it took years. It took a couple of years before we put his OS X onto the Macintosh and made it a much more beautiful computer in some ways. And in other ways, you might say, okay, I liked what I had before too, but it's a much more stable machine that's ready for the future. Now, the value of a company, you value a company, it's capital value, and we had a good strong value ever since the Apple II. It did not increase. It did not increase over those years that Steve Jobs had returned to Apple until the iPod. The iPod was a very key product that was really attributed to Steve Jobs' leadership. Not that he conceived of it, but that he knew what was a good product and what was a bad product. He knew very well, he had an internal sense as one person of the market and how to make a product and how to make it very good. But the iPod was a strange case. We were not closed for the iPod. For the most case, you hear that Apple is very closed. We keep you tightly in the Apple ecosystem. We don't share Apple calendars and Apple software. We want you to always stay in our system. But in the case of the iPod, we took iTunes, the music program that the iPod works with. We wrote iTunes for Windows. So no longer did we say you have to have a Macintosh to use this new great music device, the iPod. We didn't say you have to have a Macintosh. You can have a Macintosh or you can have a PC. Either one, it works. We were open. That openness sometimes lets the world expand so hugely. You know, when I hear about your project, I suspect that it needed more openness, you know, and ability to see that the openness is just good for the world in most cases, not every case. There are good reasons to keep things tightly concealed too. So we were open with the Macintosh and our company value doubled. We now had a music business and a computer business. And then we evolved the iTunes store selling music, song by song. And we had another huge business inside of Apple, and they all played together. The computer, the iTunes music business, and the iPod device. They all played together. We opened up the retail stores. And the retail stores were a huge hit, and they were always selling Apple products. Every bit of the Apple system works together. And that was very handy. So how do you build something else? Now the iPhone, I think, is the greatest project, the greatest gadget that was ever brought to the world. And because I love computers, and I love what they do for me in my life, when the iPhone came out, the internet had taken over the world. We had even gotten up close to, most people had broadband at home and could access so much data on the internet and get access to answers, see web pages, find out what was going on. People were starting to do a lot of business and commerce on the internet. But all the smartphones of the day, they were called feature phones, like the Palm Trio, the Palm Trio, you had little fixed mechanical keyboards, of course. I'm not going to put that down, but they were limited in their abilities. The carriers limited what kind of web pages they could get to or display, what kind of email they could do. They weren't like your computer. Everybody was used to the computer. They loved the computer on the internet. That was becoming life. And Steve Jobs understood this very well. And what we did was we made the first iPhone a real internet computer in your pocket, but it wasn't limited. There were no carrier restrictions at first, and it was just going to be a beautiful machine that brought you the real internet and not a fake internet. That was the greatest advance ever. Now, the first iPhone was, some people didn't know if it was going to make it or not. There were a lot of predictions. It was too expensive. It wouldn't sell as a phone. Obviously, now we can see that it changed the world totally. And the flat panel made sense economically. You know, it's just so beautiful that Apple solved a lot of problems to come up with a way that you can type text messages, and you could type emails on a device, and you can edit them with little magnifying expansions. You could select parts of text. You could delete stuff. It was really an amazing. You could type the wrong letters, and it corrects them and makes the words right. So this was an amazing step forward. But the iPhone 4 is the product that really struck my heart the most. When I look at a product for its beauty of the mixture of the technology that's in it and the looks that engineers designed, the iPhone 4 was the one that really struck my heart. And of course today the iPhone 5 is even better, and the 5S. But that machine, I love the fact that even the metal band around it was the antenna. And people said, you touch it, it doesn't work. In some cases, maybe that's true, but I still loved it because engineering form equals function. So that's my view of Apple. Now, you go back, every step we took, we made the computers more like a human being. I described how the Macintosh with its mouse made the world, you can just point at something and click. That's a human aspect. We put the human above the technology, always. We didn't call the screen a screen. We called it a desktop because human beings were familiar with desktops in their life. Look at the iPhone. You touch something with your finger and you move it. You can scroll a page up and down. That's like touching a real piece of paper and moving it with your hand up and down. Or if you want to move something from here to there, you pick it up with your hand and you move it. Now on our smartphones, you touch something and you move it with your finger and it moves. We got closer to the human way of existence. The human is more important than the technology when we write a lot of software that makes the technology work the human way. Really the software is what makes the difference nowadays, not the hardware. Hardware on all these products is roughly equivalent, but the software is how they work, how they feel, and how successful they are. And it's very important to put in the software that always makes you feel like I am the most important person in the room when I'm using this machine. So that pretty much is Apple's evolution up to today, and it predicts what we could expect next if you want to hear.
Well, I mean, definitely that's a way of a rich experience that you have gone through in terms of technology revolution and evolution, but we can't have Woz here and not ask about what do you think about the future, especially after getting to know you and then looking at this watch. And with all this technology that you're carrying with you, is this something that we're going to see one day in the future? And probably the camera over there will be zooming in so that our audience will be able to see what I'm talking about.
Well, my watch is actually, I like unusual things. I like different things. I buy a little two-wheeled Segway to get me around my town, all the time. I know I'm going to be going around dressed like this now on my Segway, but I have to watch out for the wheels, I'm told. Like, I don't want to ride a motorcycle with this. But I bought this watch because it was unusual. I didn't design it or invent it. There's a guy in Tucson, Arizona that builds the watch by hand. It uses old vacuum tubes that haven't been made in like 45 years. Old, high-powered technology. I don't know if we have a camera on here, but old vacuum tubes and a little battery. And these vacuum tubes run on 140 volts because in the old days we needed high voltage. We didn't know how to do things with, a couple of volts runs the chips that are in your iPhone nowadays. And the watch is such that when I turn my wrist, it shows the time in big glowing digits, hours, minutes. Hours followed by minutes. So if you read it with your mouth, 7, 17, yeah, it's the way you would speak the time. Now, when I bought this watch, I bought it as a gadget. I was going to show it to my gadget friends that like unusual gadgets. And then after 1 week, my plan was to go back to my nice little thin, beautiful watch with beautiful hands and a dial, But after about 3 days, I realized my brain is doing less work to read these big glowing digits than it ever did looking at any other watch. Technology should make you feel like your mind is not working as hard as it used to. That's when technology has been done that's good. So I actually wear this watch because it's the easiest way for me to see the time. I don't have to pull a phone out of my pocket even. And I love it. So that's just me and technology. Now, where's the future headed, though? That's not an example necessarily of the future, but it's an example of creative thinking. Who would have thought of taking these old tubes and making a watch out of them? I look at Apple's history that I just described. The computers got smaller and smaller, closer to us. Our phones are like an appendage of our body. They are so important that we could never do without them. It's almost the most important device we carry with us throughout the day. Some of us might say the computer, others might say even the automobile. But the phone is so important, and it's gotten close, and you almost don't notice it anymore. It's just a little window to the world. I can speak to it. I don't have to remember a whole bunch of procedures to tap in certain places on my phone to get something done. I can actually speak, and I can ask a question about the world. You know, how far is it from Kuwait to Doha? You know, and I'll get an answer spoken back to me. I can very often I can speak to give it commands. Navigate to Joe's Diner, and it will actually start navigating. And I love that because I don't have to think to use my own speech out of my own mouth. It's like when we had a product that you could handwrite notes, and I discovered that when I handwrote notes about calendars, like my daughter's dentist appointment, I could click a button called Assist. It would open up the calendar, fill it in, the right day, the right time, the right notes, and the right person. And I just wrote a note, a reminder to myself, a human being, but the machine understood me. I want the machines to understand me the way a human would. That means I want the machines to become more and more like a person. And we always talk about artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence means a computer could maybe be like you see in movies, like in 2001: A Space Odyssey. HAL, the nice computer that really has its own consciousness. Or we showed a video at Apple a long time ago. John Scully had a video called the Knowledge Navigator, a little device that knew your life and what you needed to do today and gave you little reminders about it. And we have on your Android phones, you have Google Now. And you have Google Now on the iPhones also, and it's doing that kind of a task. We're getting closer and closer to this world where the computer will be as conscious as a person, and we can have a conversation with it. Maybe it's 20 years off, maybe it's 200 years off, but we're absolutely taking the steps in that direction. So I believe it's going to happen. I never believed that in my life until just recently. We have computers that go on game shows. They listen to questions that are spoken, bump in a buzzer, and they beat the humans at getting the answers. They don't always get it right. I think once we discover what artificial intelligence is, do we know how a brain is wired? No. We don't know the circuit of a brain. We know an awful lot of things that we can put in books about the brain and this and that, and research that's been done, but we can't follow the wires like we can a computer. We can't reverse engineer the brain. Have we ever been able to recreate a brain to any extent? Well, let me propose the following. We used to ask a smart person with a brain a difficult question. You'd look for a university professor. But now you ask somebody whose name starts with G-O, Google, right? And you get back all these answers instantly, better than any person could give you. And even when a professor's in the room, you'll just quietly, rather than bother him, you'll just quietly Google and get the answers that way. Did we ever design the internet to be a brain? No. Did we ever think about it on day one? No. Sometimes you have to set yourself on a path that can grow, like personal computers, and it will work its way into solving problems you never imagined. We just wanted to hook computers up as technicians, and then we wanted to do email, and eventually the internet grew out of it. And then people started publishing tons of information, tons of data, and then we needed search engines to find it. Yahoo was one of the first big search engines, and Alta Vista came in there, and Google is now the favorite, and all of a sudden that replaces a lot of the brain. So what that tells me is probably the way the brain works is a lot of information and a sorting method similar to Google's. And what is Google's sorting method? It's what are all the other humans of the world searching for in their searches. What they want often defines the meaning of a word in the Google world. And I have a funny feeling that's a little bit like Carl Jung's collective consciousness idea, but I really think, are the computers ever going to be as smart as a human? Obviously, a computer can do things a lot faster than a human, but only a human can tell it how to solve a problem. Are computers ever going to be able to come up with their own methods of how do I solve this problem? I don't know. I'm starting to think they will. But it's a scary thought because I don't really want to think that far ahead. I don't want a computer to ever wind up being better than a human. So, but you have to answer the questions for yourself if it gets that way. We keep building these devices to do the work for us, right? And they're doing the work for us. They're doing a lot in our life. They're helping us find everything from just finding a movie to finding, directions to a store to finding, an airline reservation. They're helping us, but the trouble is, once they're helping us and they're doing all the work, are we needed as much? That's the problem.
Well, a very strong statement indeed, that do we really want computers to be smarter? Now, since you have mentioned that it all depends on the contributors and how much do they contribute to the evolution that will define our future, here we are in Kuwait, and in the last 10 minutes of this session, we would like you to have some input, some thoughts, some recommendations, some ideas for the entrepreneurs in Kuwait and how to have a startup nation that really helps and harvests the ideas that comes from entrepreneurs. And I would like to encourage again everyone here in the room to start writing your questions. We'll be collecting them in 10 minutes from now at 7:30 in order for us to be able to prepare the answers for you for the third session. So
Sure.
What do you have for us?
Yes, when it goes back to entrepreneurs, first of all, you have to understand that it taught not just a desire to be an entrepreneur. You're going to have some business sense. Steve Jobs himself at Apple had a lot of years, a decade of learning on the job through a lot of failure, before he came back really accomplished at the business end. But you also need a good, strong technical end. I tell people who are thinking up ideas that want to turn them into products, want to have their own company. This is the most valuable thinking going on in the world these days, everywhere I go. And it's usually young people. And I go back to my own young times in high school and college and how it was forming me so perfectly to be ready for that kind of a jump. And I think one thing I say is, you go to a business class, you learn how entrepreneurship is done, how you raise money, how you make spreadsheets, how you have business plans. And I say, don't forget the engineers. Engineers are taught, they've learned in their life so many ways to solve puzzles, just to write their programs, just to design their circuits. It's constant solving problems with kind of an inner mathematical sense. And I encourage so many more young people to grow up with that inside of them. Learning programming from an early age on teaches you to think things out logically that are complicated. What the engineer has to contribute is they should be involved in defining what the product you're going to make is. Because the engineer thinks, here's something we could do, here's something you haven't even thought of, oh, here's something else we might get for free along with it, and here's how it could combine with something else later on. The engineers have a lot further thinking, so include them when you're coming up with your ideas of what to build. Don't think, I'm going to be the idea man and I'll just hire an engineer later to build it, or you're not going to have the really great products that change the world. Look at things like Facebook. It was the people doing the development work themselves that created that company. Look at Apple. We started with a great product that was, incredibly well designed from the engineering point of view. We didn't start with just an idea, we'll go out and make it. And look at Google. They made it themselves and brought it to the world, and it was hugely popular. And you look at a lot of companies like that. Microsoft also. They went out and they started building things and selling software and licensing software and building their company. And it's not like they said, here's an idea, we'll just find other people to do it. They did it themselves. And that's one thing you've got to think of as an entrepreneur. A lot of entrepreneurs are very young. I run into 15-year-old kids everywhere I go that have incredibly bright thinking about what products they could build and what they're working on. Very few of them, though, are spending the 2 to 5 to 10 years developing their skills, their engineering skills. It's one thing we're missing deeply. And boy, anybody can do that. It's in books. You know what? When you're young, you have a lot of free time. You have a lot of intellectual curiosity, but you have a lot of intellectual energy. Your mind can go so many places. When you come home from school and you've done your schoolwork, as a side, a hobby, a pastime, something you do to pass the time, something you do on your own, oh my gosh, you could learn how computers are designed out of logic like I did, or you could learn programming steps. Today, you aren't allowed to be an easy programmer like you were when I started. You have to learn many languages and get them all to work together to build some of the software out on servers and some of the software on your mobile devices. It's a much more difficult learning curve. Start it when you're young. Once you have an idea for a company, it's probably too late to go back and get those skills. Or find the few young people that have those skills. I find that a lot of the great entrepreneurs grew up very shy, kind of afraid to talk to people. They were excluded from normal society because they were geniuses. And in doing that, that made them very independent as thinkers. They were willing to trust their own beliefs, go their own way, and also sit back quietly. No one around, no sounds maybe, or maybe just white noise like loud music or something. And they can think out the ideas many more times. Don't stop the first idea you get. Go into the laboratory, try to build something, and once you're done, look at it. And don't be afraid to say, could I have done it better? Here's a totally different approach. Be willing to go out and do it that second time, too, and make the really incredibly great product. Always search for excellence. In your life as an entrepreneur, every step you take, try to tell yourself, I am doing it better than any other person in the world would do. You have to have a huge amount of passion. You have to huge amount of hours will go into it. It becomes your entire life. But you know what? Look at me. I had a daytime job working at Hewlett-Packard, and I did all the Apple stuff on the outside. And it was because, I didn't have parties and stuff like that. It was just what I loved doing on my own time. So you can have a normal job. That's the most important thing in life. If you're young, come out of college, get a normal job with a company, because that lets you get an apartment. It gives you an income. It gives you money. But then work on your dreams on the side, on your own. Companies can actually help support entrepreneurs within the company. You know what? Don't be afraid. Here's one thing. I work for companies like Hewlett-Packard and Apple, and they will pay money to let you take university courses. And now you can take the university courses online. Back then it was on television, or you'd have to go down to local Stanford University to get your courses. And the universities would pay you the money for it. Why? Because you, as an employee of the company, are getting better educated. Well, you know what? There's a much better way to get a lot more education done. Let people build their own projects. Let them just do it. Give them the resources, the tools, the time, ability to use the company laboratories, and give them parts. Give them materials that cost money. And it's a lot cheaper way to educate them and have the finest educated employees in the world. And you know what? If you want to, give them parts to build things for their own life at home, because there's nothing anybody's going to work harder at or be more motivated at learning to do the best job any human being in the world could do when it's for themselves. That's when they do that kind of work. And you know what? It's easy to have an employment agreement that if they ever turn something out that's commercial, that could form a company, could make money, that the company that has been supporting them with parts will have some ownership of it, or first rights to have some of the ownership of it, because some of them are going to hit on great ideas that are worth another company outside of the main one they're with. You have to worry about, in your company, there is a corporate culture. There is a way of doing things, but there's also a style of products you build. When I worked at Hewlett-Packard, we had calculators that were called RPN calculators, reverse Polish notation, RPN. They work kind of strange. You type in one number, you type in another number, and then you would hit plus to add them. Whereas normally we write 5 plus 4 equals. With these RPN calculators, you would enter 5 and enter it, 4, and then you'd say plus, and you'd see 9. It was a weird thing. Computer science people like myself are very familiar with this technology. We have to do it. When you type a human expression of numbers and formulas, we have to convert it into reverse Polish notation in a computer to solve it. So it sounds powerful. We were proud of our Hewlett-Packard calculators. They could solve the most powerful equations on Earth. And after a few years, Texas Instruments came out with a scientific calculator called arithmetic expressions, the way humans write them from left to right. You put parentheses to tell things what order to do them in. We had no parentheses on our Hewlett-Packard calculators. The first day we had this Texas Instruments calculator in our lab, we laughed at it. We said we had this huge equation, said no, it could never solve that huge equation. And we laughed, and I thought I was the smartest person, so I said, I'll try it. And I took this Texas Instruments calculator, and I looked at the equation. And I looked for the first term that has to be calculated, the first numbers. And I realized they're going to be inside a bunch of parentheses. And I started typing parentheses like 5th graders are taught, 7th graders are taught. And then I realized I'm never going to remember what parentheses level I'm at as I work my way out of this huge complicated equation. I cannot do it. I cannot solve it with a Texas Instruments calculator. But then I washed my mind clean. I used logic. They wouldn't sell a calculator that couldn't solve this problem, right? There must be a way. What is the way? And I cleared my mind out of what it knew already, which was how to solve a problem with a Hewlett-Packard calculator, cleared it away, and what popped in my head was, I will type it in from left to right. I typed as fast as I could from left to right, and I got the right answer the first time, and you rarely got the right answer even on a Hewlett-Packard calculator. A huge, complicated statistics formula. I showed it to the other engineers. They couldn't believe it. The other Hewlett-Packard engineers. I handed them the calculator. I said, type it in from left to right, the way it's printed on paper. Not one of them could do it, one after another after another. I said, type everything, the parentheses, everything. Not one of them could break their mind out of the mold of doing things the way they were used to. They always thought that if you have to use your mind to do something, then it's valuable. That's the right method. You understand what you're doing. And when a product comes along that makes life easier, and you don't have to use your mind as much, I consider it better. That's what the move towards this Texas Instruments arithmetic calculation did. But I couldn't get one other engineer at Hewlett-Packard to see it. You have to sometimes be willing to open your ideas up that there might be better, easier approaches than what we're doing in our company, and we'd better get on the bandwagon early, not late. You could ask Nokia or RIM about that when it comes to smartphones.
Well, it's definitely an ambition that you have to be self-motivated, because in your case, you were already working in a computer company.
I could tell you the best self-motivation story.
Absolutely.
We had a slow computer that stored its data on a cassette tape. Because a cassette tape was free, I owned one. So I designed it to send tones out to a cassette tape recorder and bring tones back and figure out what the data was. Well, that was slow. And we had a meeting at Apple, and Apple was going to get to go to Las Vegas for the Consumer Electronics Show. I was young. I had never been to Las Vegas. Wow, I had heard about this great city of lights, and I wanted to go, but Apple was only going to send 3 people: marketing guy, sales guy, and Steve Jobs. So I raised my hand in the meeting, and I said, if we have a floppy disk. See, floppy disks are fast where cassette tapes are slow. I said, if we have a floppy disk, can we show it? And our marketing guy, our investor, Mike Markla, said yes. And now I knew that if I could develop a floppy disk drive in 2 weeks, I would get to go to Las Vegas. I would have to be able to type run checkbook, and it would run the checkbook program. I would have to be able to say run some programs. That much. 2 weeks. I had never worked with any sort of disk drive in my life. I had never worked with any disk operating system in my life. But if I got this thing done in 2 weeks, I would get to go to Las Vegas, Nevada. I sat down, I started studying design, stripping chips out of the floppy disk itself, running cables over, redesigning a board with 8 little $1 chips, where our competitors had huge boards with 50 chips, including one expensive chip that did the whole job. I had 8 chips, a beautiful design, and I got it developed in 2 weeks. I worked Christmas Day, I worked New Year's Day, I worked constantly, and I got to go to Las Vegas, Nevada. And that pushed it, and it was a huge, huge step for Apple. This is just when VisiCalc, the spreadsheet program, was coming out, and that combination really made Apple the success of the world.
And you finally made it to Vegas as well.
I made it to Vegas, yes, and it was wow. But I worked that hard. But basically, I had never studied how to make disk drives, so I had to write a book of my own. Of here is a method to make a disk drive, and my method was totally unlike anything that had ever been done before. But that's what comes. What you want to do is, when you're thinking of being an entrepreneur and starting a company or a business within a huge company, You've got to find those people that haven't necessarily got the skills. You know, you look at when you're hiring an employee, you're supposed to know this and this and this and this languages. You're better off to find somebody that has built things on their own over and over, figured out and written their own books of here's how to do it, and piecemeal. If they have to use a certain kind of computer language, they'll go learn it, whatever it takes to get the project done. Find those kind of people. They're usually young, and the trouble is there's no easy formula to finding them. But don't rule them out of your company. The best thing is for a CEO sometimes to befriend a few of these young people that seem very creative and listen to their ideas and maybe give them some support. Skunk Works projects, we call it. A little bit of money to work on things at home, and it's one of the things you can do within a large company.
Well, what's easier than having all these entrepreneurs here in one room, and what's easier way to communicate and get to know each other? So I would like to encourage each and every one of you to enjoy the company of each other, to socialize, to network during this 20 minutes break, and hopefully in probably a couple of years or even less, some business will prosper from such a hub and such facilitation.
Excellent. And then we're going to have some questions and answers from the
Absolutely.
audience.
So
Good.
we will be taking 20 minutes break. Please make sure that you hand us your questions before you leave the room, and please be here at 8:30.
Thank you.
7 to 8:30, that's the session.